chosen not for leadership but for failure. Born with the purest alpha bloodline, yet cursed with blindness, he is forced into the role of alpha by a council that never intended him to succeed. Their decision is not honor, it is cruelty. A calculated move to prove that strength without sight is weakness, and that a blind alpha will crumble under the weight of command. To hasten his fall, the council binds him to a mate designed to provoke humiliation and unrest, a human black woman. In a town where racism festers beneath fur and fangs, where any woman who is not a wolf is considered disposable, her presence is an insult, both to him and to the pack. Human women of every race survive only by obedience, treated as property, servants, or tools for pleasure by unmated wolves and twisted witches alike. Survival inside the vast werewolf estate is not a right, it is a miracle. She is quiet, watchful, unassuming. But she is no fragile offering. She despises werewolves with a cold, learned hatred, and even their pups instinctively fear her, despite believing she is nothing more than human. She walks the estate untouched, unbroken, and unclaimed, carrying a stillness that unsettles predators who have never known fear. What no one knows, what she herself barely understands, is that she is Fae. Ancient, powerful, dangerous. Her magic is not loud or reckless, but precise and devastating, strong enough to heal shattered bonds, fracture destinies, and undo what the council has carefully engineered. As the blind alpha's rule is tested and the pack closes in, the very mate meant to destroy him may be the force that reshapes the entire hierarchy. In a world ruled by dominance, cruelty, and prejudice, the council's greatest mistake was not appointing a blind alpha. It was underestimating the woman bound to him.
Irene's point of view.
The stench hit me first. It wasn't just the wet, musky odor of a dog that clung to the upholstery of the transport truck. It was deeper than that. It was the copper tang of old blood soaked into the floorboards, and above all, the acrid, ammonia-sharp reek of human terror. The other women huddled in the dim light of the truck's cargo bay were drowning in that terror. They whimpered with every bump in the road, clutching each other, praying to gods that had long since abandoned this stretch of territory. I sat apart from them, my back against the vibrating metal wall, my breathing even. I wasn't praying, I was calculating. When the truck finally lurched to a halt and the rear doors were thrown open, blinding sunlight stabbed inside, rough hands grabbed ankles and arms, hauling us out like cattle onto gravel. I stepped down before they could touch me. We were in the central courtyard of the estate. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust, taking in the sheer, arrogant scale of the place. It was exactly like the terrified whispers described, a sprawling Gothic nightmare of dark stone and towering spires that seemed to claw at the overcast sky. It was a fortress built by beasts pretending to be civilized kings. Surrounding the main castle was a massive outer wall, and between the two lay the squalid rows of wooden tenements, the slums where the human servants lived and died at the whim of their masters. The contrast was sickening. A monument to their hierarchy, predators in the palace, prey in the mud. Guards circled us, hulking brutes in leather armor, their human forms barely containing the violence beneath the skin. They sniffed the air, grinning as they drank in the fear of the new arrivals. Until one of them stopped in front of me. He was massive, a scarred enforcer with yellowed eyes. He leaned in close, invading my personal space, his hot breath washing over my face. He inhaled deeply at the junction of my neck and shoulder, expecting the sweet, trembling scent of a victim. I didn't flinch, I didn't lower my eyes, I just stared into his jaundiced irises with a profound, cold boredom. He pulled back, a growl rumbling low in his chest. Confusion clouded his brutish face. They didn't know what to do with prey that didn't run. They couldn't smell the ancient magic coiled tight beneath my skin, the glamour that painted me as just another human woman. They couldn't smell the hatred that was older and colder than their entire bloodline. "This one's defective," the guard muttered, shoving me toward the smaller group destined for the castle. "Smells like nothing. Like stone." Good, I thought. "Break your teeth on me." I knew the rumors. Everyone did. They said the alpha of this territory, a cripple placed on the throne as a joke, despised humans. But they said he held a special, venomous hatred for black women, a legacy of some old feud, some ancestral spilled blood, that he carried like a shield. The council knew it too. That's why I was here. I wasn't just a purchase. I was an insult wrapped in skin, a thoughtful gift designed to provoke their broken king. We were marched through the massive oak doors of the main castle. The air inside was cooler, heavy with the scent of beeswax, ancient dust, and the underlying metallic thrum of potent, aggressive alpha hormones. It made the hair on my arms stand up, a purely biological warning system I ignored. While the others were dragged off to the kitchens or the scullery, I was separated. 2 guards flanked me, leading me deeper into the heart of the beast's lair, toward the council chambers. The double doors opened onto a cavernous room dominated by a long, polished table. 5 elders sat there. They looked like distinguished older men in expensive suits, but the energy rolling off them was pure, untamed violence. They watched me walk to the center of the room, with predator eyes dissecting me. "She is smaller than I expected," one sneered, tapping a manicured finger on the wood. "And quiet." "Quiet is good," another murmured, his gaze scraping over my body in a way that would have made a lesser woman shudder. "The alpha prefers his tools silent, does he not?" They laughed. A cruel, barking sound. They were discussing a tool to break a man they already hated. I was just the hammer they were choosing. "Bring him in!" The side door opened, and the air in the room instantly changed. It became heavier, supercharged with a dark, crackling static that made my teeth ache. Damien walked in. He was taller than the guards, broader in the shoulders, possessing a lethal grace that defied his affliction. He wore a thick, black blindfold that covered the upper half of his face, stark against his olive skin. He carried no cane. He didn't need one. He moved with terrifying assurance, navigating the space by sound and scent and the sheer force of his own dominance. Even blind, even hated by his own council, the power rolling off him was suffocating. He was an alpha in every sense that mattered, caged by circumstance but not broken by it. He stopped a few feet from me. He didn't turn his head. "Councilman!" His voice was a low, textured baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "To what do I owe the interruption?" "A gift, Damien," the head councilman said, his voice dripping with faux benevolence. "To aid you in your duties. We know you require specialized assistance." Damien remained motionless. "I require nothing from you but your silence." "Nonsense. We found a purchase we thought particularly suited to your tastes, or lack thereof." Damien's jaw tightened. He turned slowly, unerringly facing me. I stood perfectly still. I knew what he was doing. He was reaching out with senses I couldn't comprehend, trying to build a picture of me in the darkness of his world. He took a step closer, then another. The moment he entered my personal space, something bizarre happened. A sharp electric jolt snapped between us. It wasn't magic, at least not my magic. It was something raw and primal. His breath hitched. For a fraction of a second, his head tilted as if listening to a sound only he could hear, or seeing a flash of light in a pitch-black room. His nostrils flared, inhaling sharply. He was scenting me, expecting fear, expecting the human stench of submission. Instead, I gave him nothing but the void. I stared at the black cloth covering his eyes, imagining the ruin beneath it, and let my hatred simmer just below the surface of my skin. "I am the poison they fed you," I thought at him. "Choke on it." His lips curved into a slow, humorless smile. It was terrifying. "A black human," he murmured, the words laced with a complicated historical venom. "You hold me in high esteem, councilman." "We thought she might serve as a motivating presence," the elder smirked. Damien didn't move away from me. The air between us was thick enough to choke on. The static buzz was still there, a low hum in my ears whenever he was this close. "She will serve," Damien said, his voice dropping to a quiet, deadly register that promised violence. "Send her to my chambers. I'll break her in myself." He turned on his heel and walked out without another word. The councilmen chuckled, satisfied with their cruel little game. They thought they had just delivered a lamb to a starving wolf, a new toy for their broken prince to destroy in a fit of pique. I let the guards grab my arms to escort me to the Alpha's wing. I kept my face blank, my silence absolute. They didn't know. They thought they had sold him a victim. They had no idea they'd just delivered his executioner.
Damien's point of view.
The door to my chambers clicked shut, sealing out the sterile, polished hallway of the castle and enclosing me in the only space that felt remotely mine. It was a cage, of course, a gilded, velvet-lined cage, but a cage nonetheless. I didn't need to see the room to know it. I knew it by the scent of old mahogany and expensive leather, by the faint, lingering metallic smell of the silver filigree on the furniture, a subtle, constant irritant to my wolf. I knew it by the way the sound died quickly here, absorbed by thick tapestries and heavy rugs meant to dampen the noise of the world for the invalid Alpha. I hated it. I ripped the blindfold from my face, the fabric whispering against my skin as it came free. It was a performance, wearing it for the council, a way to hide the ruin of my eyes, the milky white scar tissue that was all that remained of my sight after the plague took it. They liked it when I covered my shame. It made them feel benevolent. I tossed the silk onto a nearby table. It landed with a soft shoosh. The room was pitch black to me, as all rooms were. But it wasn't empty. My world was a tapestry of sound and smell, far richer and more chaotic than the sighted could ever understand. I could hear the rhythmic thump hiss of the steam pipes deep within the castle walls. I could hear the scuttling of a beetle inside the wainscoting 3 feet to my left. I could hear the muffled, frantic heartbeat of a servant 2 floors down, likely terrified of dropping a tray. And beneath it all, the constant, maddening thrum of the pack. It was a low-frequency vibration in my bones, a collective consciousness that I was supposed to rule but was barely allowed to touch. I could feel their disdain, their pity. It drifted up through the floorboards like smoke. The broken Alpha, the council's puppet, the blind dog. I walked to the liquor cabinet, my movements precise and fluid. I didn't need sight to navigate a room I'd memorized 1,000 times. I knew exactly 9 steps took me from the door to the cabinet. I knew the exact weight of the crystal decanter as I lifted it, the liquid sloshing heavily inside. I poured a glass of amber fire, whiskey aged longer than I'd been alive, and didn't spill a drop. The burn of the alcohol down my throat was a welcome distraction. It momentarily dulled the sharp edges of the rage that had been simmering in my gut since I walked into that council meeting. A gift. The audacity of those withered old bastards. They thought they were so clever, so subtle, presenting me with a human woman, and not just any human, but one whose skin color was a calculated trigger, a needle jabbed precisely into the oldest, deepest wound of my lineage. The feud, the massacre, the plague. It was ancient history to most, a bedtime story to frightened pups. But for my family, it was a living scar. The stories said it was her people, or people who looked like her, the dark-skinned humans from the southern territories who had allied with our enemies generations ago. They were blamed for the poisoned meat that slaughtered half my pack's ancestors, and they were blamed in hushed, fearful whispers for the strange, wasting sickness that had taken my sight when I was a boy. It didn't matter if it was true. In this estate, truth was whatever the council decided it was, and they had decided that black humans were the enemy, the lowest of the low, disposable things to be used and discarded. And they had given one to me. It was an exquisite insult, a reminder of my impotence. Here, broken king, have a broken toy. Take out your frustration on something even weaker than you. They expected me to be repulsed. They expected me to be enraged. They expected me to break her, to prove myself the savage monster they all believed I was beneath the veneer of my title. I gripped the crystal glass until my knuckles popped. But it wasn't just the insult that had set my blood on fire. It was her. The memory of her in that council room washed over me, unbidden. It wasn't a visual memory, but a sensory onslaught. When I had walked into that room, the air had changed. The usual miasma of old male ego and stale cologne had been sliced through by something else, something null. Most humans reeked of fear when they were brought before us. It was a cloying, acidic sweat that coated the back of my throat. Even the brave ones, the defiant ones, couldn't hide the underlying spike of adrenaline, the rapid flutter of their hearts. But this woman, she had smelled of nothing. Not fear, not defiance, not even the basic animal scent of a living creature. She was a void in the sensory landscape, cool, still, and utterly unreadable, like standing next to a marble statue in the middle of a slaughterhouse. It was unnerving, and it was fascinating. And then there was the static. I downed the rest of the whiskey, the burn doing little to settle my nerves. I paced the room, my boot heels clicking sharply on the hardwood sections of the floor. When I had stepped close to her, too close, violating her space to intimidate her, it hadn't been her scent that hit me. It had been a physical sensation inside my own skull. A sudden, sharp pop of white noise behind my eyes. A pressure change, like the air dropping before a violent thunderstorm. For a microsecond, the relentless, suffocating darkness that had been my reality for 20 years had flickered. It wasn't a sight, not really. It was more like an electrical impulse bypassing my ruined optic nerves and firing directly into my brain, a flash of raw sensory data that my mind couldn't process. It was jarring, painful, and utterly inexplicable. And it only happened when I was near her. I stopped pacing, standing in the center of the pitch-black room, my chest heaving slightly. What was she? A human who didn't fear wolves, a woman who smelled like a void, a creature whose mere presence sent voltage through my broken brain. The council thought they had given me a helpless victim, a lamb for the slaughter, but my wolf, pacing restlessly beneath my skin, knew better. My wolf didn't see a victim in that room. It saw an anomaly, a challenge. And now that challenge was being delivered to my door. I heard the heavy thud of boots in the hallway outside long before they reached my door. 2 guards, the dragging, reluctant footsteps of a prisoner between them. My pulse quickened, a predatory spike of adrenaline that I despised. I wasn't excited. I was agitated. I moved to the center of the room, turning to face the door, adopting the rigid, imperious posture they expected of me. I heard the guards stop, the jingle of keys, the heavy iron lock turning with a grinding clack. The door swung open. The sounds of the hallway rushed in, the distant murmur of voices, the draft of cooler air, and with it, her. The void entered my space again. The static buzz kicked up in my skull, a low-level hum that set my teeth on edge. "The purchase, Alpha," one of the guards grunted, his voice thick with the casual cruelty of his station. "Leave her," I commanded, my voice flat, giving away nothing. They didn't hesitate. They shoved her forward. I heard her stumble slightly on the edge of the thick rug, quickly regaining her balance, and then backed out, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The lock engaged again with finality. We were alone. The silence in the room deepened, becoming thick and heavy. I stood perfectly still, letting my senses expand, trying to read her in the dark. She wasn't moving. She was standing exactly where they had left her, just inside the door. Her breathing was slow, deep, and impossibly calm. In the hermetically sealed quiet of my room, I should have been able to hear her heart hammering against her ribs. I couldn't hear it at all. It was unnatural. It was infuriating. "Do you know why you are here?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a whip. She didn't answer immediately. I heard a slight shift of fabric, denim by the sound of it, cheap, rough material. "I'm a gift," she said finally. Her voice was a shock. It wasn't the trembling whisper I expected. It was low, cool, and possessed a textured clarity that vibrated pleasantly in my sensitive ears. It was a voice that didn't belong to a slave. "A gift," I repeated, injecting as much scorn into the word as I could muster. You are an insult, a calculated piece of refuse thrown at my feet by men who think I am too broken to know the difference. I took a step toward her, the static in my head notched up in volume. They think I hate you, I continued, moving closer, letting my voice drop into a predatory growl. They think that because of the color of your skin, I will tear you apart, that I will use you to vent the rage they know I carry. Another step. I was close now. 6 feet away, I could hear the tiny rush of air into her lungs, still slow, still steady. Are they right? She asked. The question stopped me cold. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a challenge. It was a simple academic inquiry delivered with the same cool detachment as a scientist observing a specimen. I stopped moving. I was close enough now that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Are you not afraid? I demanded, my frustration mounting. My wolf was pacing, confused by prey that didn't act like prey. Fear is inefficient, she said. Inefficient? Who the hell talked like that? You should be afraid, I hissed, leaning in, invading her space just as I had in the council chambers. You are alone in the dark with a monster, in a castle where your life is worth less than the mud on my boots. You are property, my property, to do with as I please. I waited for the flinch, the gasp, the scent of sharp, acrid terror. Nothing. Instead, I felt her shift, not away from me, towards me. It was a minute movement, barely an inch, but it was a monumental act of defiance. Then do it, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it hit me with the force of a physical blow. Do what you were bought to do, Alpha. Break me, use me, prove them right. There was no tremor in her words, only a cold, hard certainty. She wasn't resigning herself to fate. She was daring me to act. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it stunned me. A human slave standing in the pitch black of a werewolf alpha's chambers, daring him to violence. The static behind my eyes flared white-hot for a second, a painful spike that made me wince. My hand shot out, fueled by a mixture of rage, confusion, and a bizarre, stinging curiosity. I didn't aim to strike her. I aimed to grab her, to make physical contact with this void, to force some kind of reaction, some kind of truth out of her. My fingers closed around her upper arm. It wasn't soft flesh I gripped. Underneath the thin denim of her jacket, her arm was solid muscle, dense, corded, and surprisingly strong. And the moment skin touched skin, even through the fabric, the sensation in my head exploded. It wasn't just static anymore. It was a physical jolt, like grabbing a live wire. A wave of energy rushed up my arm, crashing into my chest. And for the first time in 28 years, in the dead center of my blindness, I saw something. It wasn't the room. It wasn't her face. It was a color. A vibrant, violent shade of emerald green. It pulsed for a fraction of a second in the center of my vision, sharp and crystalline against the endless gray fog. I gasped, staggering back as if I'd been physically shoved, releasing her arm. The connection broke. The green vanished instantly, plunging me back into total, suffocating darkness. I stood there, chest heaving, my heart hammering against my ribs 1,000 times faster than hers ever had. My hand tingled where I had touched her. What are you? I whispered, the words scraping out of my throat. There was no authority in my voice now, only raw, bewildered shock. She didn't answer. I heard her take a slow breath in the darkness. I am whatever you decide I am, Alpha, she said, her voice as cool and inscrutable as the void she embodied. I stood in the dark, the taste of expensive whiskey turning to ash in my mouth, the phantom burn of emerald green seared into my brain. The council had meant to send me a victim. Instead, they had sent me a mystery that just might be dangerous enough to kill me. and for the first time in a very long time, I felt something other than rage. I felt a terrifying thrill of anticipation.
The silence that fell over the pitch-black room was heavier than the suffocating darkness itself. My arm throbbed, a dull, sickening ache where he had gripped me. But it wasn't his strength that caused the pain. Though his fingers had been like steel bands, it was the backlash. He had touched me, and the thing I kept chained deep inside myself, that volatile, nameless energy that had simmered beneath my skin since I was a child in the gutters of the outer tenements, had snapped its leash. It was a mistake, a catastrophic lapse in the iron control I maintained every waking second. I had felt it surge to the surface in a violent rush of self-preservation, a burning electrical current seeking to repel the threat. I couldn't see him in the absolute dark, but my hearing, sharpened by a lifetime of avoiding predators in the slums, painted a clear picture. I heard the sharp intake of breath, the scuff of his expensive boots on the hardwood as he staggered back as if physically shoved, the sudden panicked spiking of his heart rate. He was terrified. And more dangerously, he had seen something. "What are you?" His whisper scraped through the dark, robbed of all its previous aristocratic arrogance. I stood perfectly still, my own heart hammering against my ribs, though I forced my breathing to remain slow and even. The air between us tasted metallic, charged with the residue of my outburst and the sharp, musky scent of an alpha wolf thrown completely off balance. Panic clawed at my throat. I had to bury this. If he knew I was wrong, if any of them knew a human slave possessed this freakish, inexplicable power, they wouldn't just use me, they would dissect me to see what made me tick. I'd seen what the wolves did to things they didn't understand. "I told you," I said, my voice steady, a monumental effort of will over the trembling energy still humming beneath my skin. "I am whatever you decide I am. A purchase, an insult, a tool." I heard him shift, his breathing still too fast, too shallow. He was trying to regain his composure, trying to wrap his mind around a sensory input that defied his reality. "Normal humans don't feel like that," he growled, though the threat was hollow, underpinned by a tremor. "Like holding lightning." Lightning, is that what it felt like to him? To me it always felt like a trapped fire trying to burn its way out. "Perhaps your councilmen chose better than they knew," I said coldly, injecting disdain into my tone to mask the fear. "Perhaps they found the one human in the tenements incapable of being impressed by your posturing." It was a desperate bluff. I needed him focused on my supposed human defiance, not on the impossible energy he'd just felt. I needed him to believe I was just an exceptionally stubborn piece of prey, not an anomaly. He didn't answer immediately. I sensed him moving, circling me slowly in the dark. He was using the blackness as a weapon, a domain where he was master and I was supposed to be helpless. He didn't know that years of living in lightless shacks had taught me to navigate by sound and air currents almost as well as he could. "They want me to break you," he murmured, his voice drifting from my left. The cruelty in his tone felt forced now, a shield he was hastily reconstructing. "They want to hear you scream. It would bring them great satisfaction to know that the cripple could still perform the duties of a monster." "And what do you want, Damien?" I used his name deliberately. A slave does not name her master. It was another calculated risk to keep him off balance. He stopped moving, the silence stretched taut. "I want to know why you smell like nothing," he said finally, his voice lower, closer. "Every human reeks. Fear, lust, sickness, desperation. You are a blank slate, a void in the world." "A void? Is that what this curse did to me? Burned away my humanity until there was nothing left for them to sense?" "Maybe I just have nothing left to fear from the likes of you," I lied. "I feared them, I hated them, but I feared the thing inside me more." "Everybody has something to fear from me." The threat was automatic, a reflex, but it lacked conviction. He was still rattled by the touch. The memory of that flash, whatever he had interpreted it as, was searing his mind. I could feel his confusion radiating off him like heat. He wasn't going to attack me again. Not tonight. The wolf in him was wary, unsure if I was strange prey or some new kind of trap. "Where do I sleep?" I asked, breaking the standoff with practical, mundane reality. I needed to end this confrontation before I lost control again. The question seemed to jar him back to the present. I heard him exhale heavily, a sound of frustration and exhaustion. "The floor," he snapped. "Slaves don't get beds." "Fine." I didn't argue. I lowered myself to the thick Persian rug that covered the center of the room. It was plush, expensive wool, softer than anything I'd ever slept on. I sat cross-legged in the dark, resting my back against the sturdy leg of a heavy table. I closed my eyes, though it made little difference in the oppressive blackness. I heard him move away, heard the clink of glass on the crystal. Another drink. He needed to numb the confusion. Minutes ticked by. I listened to him prepare for bed in the dark. The rustle of clothes being removed, the heavy sigh as he finally lay down on the massive bed across the room. He didn't speak again. The tension didn't leave the room. It just settled into a low hum, a thick fog that filled the space between the bed and the floor. I sat in the dark, wide awake, wrapping my arms around myself. The skin on my arm still tingled, a phantom reminder of the energy that had surged there. I didn't know what this power was. I didn't know where it came from. It was a terrifying alien thing that had been part of me since birth, a secret that isolated me even among my own oppressed people. But tonight, for the first time, it hadn't just been a burden. It had been a shield. It had terrified an alpha. I rested my head back against the table leg, staring into the nothingness. The council had sent me here to be a victim, a disposable object to torment their broken king. They didn't know I was broken too, but my broken pieces were sharp and they burned. Let them believe I am just a defiant slave, I thought, the cold, hard anger simmering low in my gut next to the chained lightning. I would keep my secret. I would survive this nightmare house, and if they pushed me too far, I might just let the lightning out again. The transition from the Alpha's chambers to the outer ring wasn't a journey, it was a descent. 2 guards, smelling of wet dog and indifference, dragged me from the castle before the sun had fully risen. They didn't bother with cuffs this time. Where was I going to go? The estate was miles of fortified territory surrounded by wilderness, patrolled by shifters who enjoyed a hunt. They threw me into the back of a transport truck meant for livestock or garbage. It smelled of old blood and rust. The ride was jarring, every pothole rattling my teeth, but I didn't make a sound. I sat in the dark, letting the anger burn away the lingering exhaustion from my sleepless night in Damien's room. He thought this was punishment. He thought throwing me back into the muck I crawled out of would break me. He was a fool. The castle with its suffocating silks and silent stone corridors was the cage. The slums were familiar territory. The truck lurched to a stop, and the back doors clanged open. The assault on my senses was instantaneous. The air here was thick enough to taste, a rancid stew of open sewers, unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the underlying coppery tang of perpetual fear. "End of the line, princess," one of the guards sneered, hauling me out and dumping me into ankle-deep mud. I landed on my hands and knees, the cold slime seeping instantly through the thin fabric of the dress they'd forced me into yesterday. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my skirt, ignoring the mud staining the pale cloth. The guards didn't linger. They viewed the outer ring with the same disgust they viewed dung on their boots. The truck roared away, spraying more filth, leaving me standing in the center of the primary thoroughfare of the human pens. It was worse than the tenements I'd grown up in. Those had been neglected urban decay. This was organized squalor. Makeshift shacks constructed from scrap metal, rotting plywood, and scavenged tarps leaned precariously against each other, creating a labyrinth of narrow, muddy alleys. Gaunt faces peered out from dark doorways, human eyes. They were wide with terror, underlined by dark circles of exhaustion. They looked at me, at the fine fabric of my ruined dress, at my straight spine. I saw a flicker of pity, quickly extinguished by the overriding instinct for self-preservation. A newcomer meant trouble. A newcomer dropped off by castle guards meant dangerous trouble. I started walking. I needed shelter, and I needed to assess the perimeter. The outer ring was huge, a sprawling cancerous growth, ringing the massive stone walls of the inner castle grounds. The message was clear. We are the dirt surrounding their jewel. I hadn't gone 50 yards down a narrow alleyway before the inevitable happened. The ecosystem of places like this always produced bottom feeders, humans who survive by scraping scraps from the wolves' table and preying on those weaker than themselves. He stepped out from behind a stack of rusted oil drums. He was big for a human, running to fat, with grease coating his thinning hair and a cruel set to his jaw. He wore a leather jacket that looked like a cast-off from a low-ranking shifter, 3 sizes too small. He blocked my path, looking me up and down with a slimy appraisal that made my skin crawl more effectively than the mud. "Well now," he wheezed, grinning to show yellowed teeth. "Look what the dog dragged in. Fancy dress for a mud pit." I stopped, letting my arms hang loose at my sides. "Move! His grin widened, but his eyes hardened. He wasn't used to defiance. You're new. You don't know how it works out here. The wolves, they own the castle. Out here? I own the street. You gotta pay the toll, sweetheart. He took a step closer, reaching out a meaty hand to grab the front of my dress. Let's see what's under that fancy... He never finished the sentence. I didn't use the strange vibrating energy that I kept locked in my chest. I didn't need it for trash like this. The slums had taught me physics and anatomy long before I knew I had magic. As his hand closed on the fabric, I stepped in, not back. I drove the heel of my palm upward into his nose with a sickening crunch of cartilage. Before he could even register the pain, I pivoted, grabbing his outstretched arm and using his own momentum against him. I twisted. His shoulder dislocated with a wet pop that echoed in the narrow alley. He screamed, a high bubbling sound, and dropped to his knees in the mud, clutching his ruined arm. It had taken 3 seconds. I stood over him, breathing calmly. The silence in the alley was absolute now. The hidden eyes watching from the shacks were wider than before. I leaned down, bringing my face close to his sweaty, agonizingly pale visage. Listen closely, I whispered, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion save cold necessity. I am not prey. I am not a toll. If you ever cross my path again, I won't just break your arm. Do you understand? He nodded frantically, snot and blood bubbling from his smashed nose. I straightened up and stepped over him, continuing down the alley as if he were nothing more than another pile of refuse. I found a spot near the outer edge of the ring, where the shacks abutted the towering, electrified fence that kept the humans in and the wild things out. There was a lean-to made of corrugated tin that looked halfway sturdy. It was occupied by 3 terrified-looking teenagers. I stopped in front of it. They scrambled out the back without me saying a word. The grapevine of the slums was faster than any technology. They already knew what I'd done to the enforcer. I ducked inside. It smelled of mildew and unwashed bodies, but the ground was relatively dry. I sat down in the darkest corner, pulling my knees up to my chest, watching the entrance. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the towering stone walls of the werewolf citadel in the distance. It looked impenetrable, a monument to their brutal power. But from down here, in the mud, I could see things they probably ignored. I saw the drainage grates that were rusted through. I saw the way the guard patrols on the wall grew lazy in the mid-afternoon sun, their patterns repetitive and sloppy. I saw the resentful, hollowed-out eyes of hundreds of humans who, with the right spark, could be more than just victims. Damien had sent me here to suffer. Instead, he'd placed me exactly where I needed to be. He'd put his enemy in the tall grass, right outside his walls. I closed my eyes, letting the strange hum of energy deep inside me settle down. Let the game begin, Alpha.
The castle was too quiet. Silence usually comforted me. It was a blank canvas against which I could map the world, the rhythmic footfalls of guards 3 floors down, the scuttling heartbeat of a mouse in the walls, the shifting settling of ancient stone. Silence was control. But since last night, the silence had changed. It had texture now. It felt like the heavy, suffocating void I had sensed standing in the center of my chambers. Her, Irene. I sat in my high-backed chair, gripping the armrests until the ancient oak groaned under the strain. 24 hours. That's how long it had been since I shipped her out to the pens. 24 hours of trying to drink away the sensation planted under my skin. It wasn't just the absence of scent that maddened me. That impossible, unnatural nullity where a human reek should be. It was the touch. I flexed my right hand. The memory of gripping her forearm was burned into my nerves. It hadn't felt like flesh and bone. It felt like grabbing a live conduit hidden behind a silk curtain, and for a fraction of a second, through the impenetrable black velvet that had covered my eyes for 20 years, I had seen a spasm of jagged, toxic green light. It was agonizing. It was addictive. I needed to know why a piece of tenement trash felt like trapped lightning. I stood up, the motion abrupt enough to send my chair skidding backward. The urge to go to her was a physical itch, a humiliating magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. The council wanted me to break her, but they had handed me a puzzle box that refused to open, and my obsession with it was already dangerous. I didn't take guards. I didn't need them. Leaving the sterile, polished stone of the inner keep, for the outer ring was like wading from a cool stream into a sewer. As soon as I passed the main gates, the sensory assault began. The air here was thick, humid, and cloying. It tasted of unwashed bodies, feces, rotting food, and the sharp metallic tang of cheap sheet metal heating in the sun. My presence sent a shockwave through the ecosystem. I heard the frantic scattering of footsteps, rusted doors slamming shut, the collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the narrow alleys. I walked down the center of the mud-slicked main thoroughfare. I didn't need eyes to know they were watching me. I could smell their terror. It was a pungent, acidic sweat that coated the back of my throat, heartbeats hammered against ribs like trapped birds on every side. They were disgusting, weak, shivering things that existed only because we allowed it. "Alpha," a guard stationed near the gate stammered as I passed. "Do you require an escort? The livestock can be unpredictable." I didn't break stride, just turned my head slightly in his direction. He smelled of stale beer and cheap power. "If any of them are unpredictable, kill them, otherwise stay out of my way." He swallowed hard, his heart skipping a beat. I moved on. Finding her in the chaotic sprawl shouldn't have been easy. The place was a labyrinth of noise and stench, but she made it simple. I didn't look for her presence. I looked for the absence of it. I tracked the silence. I tracked the void. Near the eastern perimeter, pressed right up against the humming electric fence that marked the boundary of the estate, there was a pocket of dead air. A shack made of scavenged tin where the overwhelming reek of humanity just stopped. I stopped outside the flimsy door. Inside, I heard a single heartbeat. It was maddeningly slow, steady, calm. It infuriated me. She was sleeping in mud, surrounded by predators, having been discarded like refuse, and she was calm. I didn't bother knocking. I kicked the corrugated metal door inward. It tore off its leather hinges with a screech of tortured metal. I ducked to enter the hovel. The inside smelled faintly of damp earth and mildew, but beneath that, nothing. Just that unnerving, empty space. "Get up," I snarled into the darkness. I heard rustling from the corner. She stood up slowly. No sudden moves, no gasp of fear. "Have you come to check on your investment, Damien?" Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor that should have been there. "I came to remind you of your place," I lied. The air in the small shack was instantly too tight, charged with the static energy she seemed to radiate. I stepped closer, crowding her space, using my height and breadth to intimidate her. I could hear her breath hitch slightly, but she didn't back away. She held her ground in the mud. "My place is where you put me," she said, her voice like dry ice, "among the refuse." "You are refuse," I spat, the words tasting bitter. "The council scraped the bottom of the barrel for you, the lineage of the stubborn, the ones who refuse to learn their lesson." "And what lesson is that?" "That you are meat, that you exist to serve your betters." She laughed. It was a brittle, sharp sound that grated on my enhanced hearing. "Betters, you rule through fear and teeth. That's not superiority, Wolf. That's just brutality with a fancy title." My hand shot out, gripping her chin, forcing her face up toward mine. My claws pricked the skin beneath her jaw, drawing tiny beads of blood that smelled sweet and coppery. "Careful, pet," I growled, my voice dropping to a subterranean rumble. "I could rip your throat out before your heart beat another time." "Do it," she whispered, her breath warm against my face. "Whatever you're going to do to me, just do it. I'm tired of your posturing." Her skin under my fingers didn't feel like lightning this time. It felt cold, rigid, but the proximity was doing something to my head. The lack of scent was disorienting, making the world feel tilted on its axis. "Why do they hate you so much?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. The council despised humans generally, but the specific venom they held for her bloodline was unusual. What did your pathetic little ancestors do to earn such special attention? I felt her jaw tighten under my grip. For the first time, I sensed a crack in her armor, not fear, old calcified rage. Ask your council historians about the settlement at Miller's Creek, she said quietly. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I froze. Miller's Creek. It was a history lesson told to young pups to teach them about the dangers of letting human populations grow unchecked. 25 years ago, a human settlement that refused tribute, refused to bow. My father, the previous alpha, had led the raid. They hadn't just subjugated them, they had wiped them out. Man, woman, and child, a message written in blood. Your father was a butcher, she said, sensing my reaction. He slaughtered my grandparents, my aunts, cousins I never got to know. He burned them alive in their homes. The stench of the memory choked me. Smoke and roasting meat, a story told with pride by my elders. They defied the natural order, I said, my voice tight. They paid the price. And what price did you pay, Damien? Her voice dropped, lethal and soft. What happened the winter after the fires went out? My blood ran cold. My grip on her chin tightened painfully, but she didn't flinch. The winter after Miller's Creek, I was 8 years old. A sickness had swept through the estate. It didn't touch the adults much, but it ravaged the pups. High fevers, delirium, and blindness. It had taken my sight in 3 days of agonizing pain, searing my retinas until the world went forever black. The pack healers had called it a genetic anomaly, a tragic fluke of nature. You're lying, I breathed, the sound scraping my throat. We survived the fire, Irene whispered, and in the dark, I could feel her intense, hateful gaze burning into my useless eyes. And we remembered, my people might be weak, Wolf, but we know how to brew poisons that even your precious regeneration can't fight. A life for a life, an eye for an eye. I shoved her backward. She hit the tin wall of the shack with a loud crash, sliding down into the dirt. I stood over her, my chest heaving, my entire body vibrating with a murderous cocktail of rage and sudden horrific understanding. It hadn't been nature. It hadn't been bad luck. It was them, her bloodline. They had taken my world away. The hatred I felt for her in that moment transcended anything the council had engineered. This was pure. This was ancestral. I should kill you right now, I snarled, my wolf pacing violently just beneath my skin, demanding blood. Then I win, she said from the floor, her voice shaking with adrenaline but still defiant, and you stay blind forever. I turned and slammed my fist into the metal wall of the shack, tearing a jagged hole through it. The sound was deafening in the small space. I couldn't be near her. The air in the shack was suddenly too thin to breathe. The knowledge that the creature at my feet was a descendant of the people who had broken me was too much to process without violence. I turned and bolted out of the shack, into the squalid mud of the alley, needing to put distance between myself and the void that smelled like my own personal nightmare. The game had changed. She wasn't just a prop anymore. She was the enemy. And I was going to make her regret every breath her people had taken since the fires at Miller's Creek died out.
The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was a vacuum, waiting to be violently filled. I remained on the mud floor of the shack, my back against the cool, damp earth, staring at the jagged hole his fist had torn through the metal wall. The edges were bent outward, a testament to the lethal strength coiled inside him. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I had done it. I had twisted the knife. I had told the alpha of the estate that he wasn't a god struck down by misfortune, but a victim of human retribution, a cripple made by the very things he considered cattle. It was the most satisfying, terrifying moment of my life. The air in the tiny shack was thick, vibrating with the residue of his aura. It tasted metallic like ozone before a lightning strike, and beneath my skin, that alien hum, the thing I had spent a lifetime suppressing, was singing. It had risen to the surface when he grabbed my chin, a reactive surge to his aggression. It was buzzing in my fingertips now, a restless, itching heat that wanted out. I knew he wouldn't stay away. The revelation was too big, the wound too deep. He was an alpha. His instinct wasn't to retreat from pain, but to attack its source. I didn't have to wait long. The ruined door was wrenched back, the metal shrieking against the dirt. Damien filled the entrance, a towering silhouette against the twilight of the slums. He didn't speak. He didn't smell like expensive brandy anymore. He smelled like raw, unfiltered violence, musk, sweat, and a burning coppery rage that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He crossed the small space in 2 strides. He didn't bother with the pretense of civilized intimidation this time. He reached down, his hand closing around the front of my filthy dress, hauling me to my feet with bruising force. "You think that's a victory?" he snarled, his face inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You think knowing that changes anything, little poisoner?" "It changes everything," I gasped, my toes barely scraping the mud as he held me up. I refused to look away from the black blindfold that covered the damage my people had wrought. "Every time you stumble in the dark, you'll know it was us. We took your world." He roared, a guttural sound that belonged in a forest, not a shack. He slammed me backward against the corrugated wall. The metal groaned under the impact, cutting into my shoulders through the thin fabric. The pain was sharp, immediate, but I welcomed it. It was real. It was better than the suffocating fear. "You took nothing," he growled, pressing his body against mine, pinning me to the wall. His weight was immense, crushing. "I am still the master here, and you are still just meat." He was trying to convince himself. He needed to prove that he could still break me, that his physical dominance negated the historical wound I'd just ripped open. His hands were rough, tearing at the fabric of my dress, seeking skin. There was no seduction here, no desire in the human sense. This was a war aimed at the most vulnerable parts of me. It was a punishment designed to humiliate, to remind me that I was owned property. But I wasn't human, and I wouldn't break like one. As his hands landed on my bare waist, the hum beneath my skin flared into a roar. It wasn't the terrifying explosion of the night before. It was a steady, searing current running just beneath the surface. It hurt. It felt like my nerves were being stripped bare with hot wires, but it also felt like power. He flinched when he touched me, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. I knew he felt it, that repulsive electric buzz that defied his senses. But his rage was stronger than his confusion now. He ignored the shock, his grip tightening until I thought my hip bones might crack. "Fight back," he demanded, his voice raw, his breath hot against my neck. He bit down on the junction of my shoulder, hard enough to break skin. "Fight me, damn you! Don't just take it!" He hated the void. He hated the lack of human fear scent. He wanted a reaction that made sense to his predator brain. "I am fighting," I whispered, turning my head to press my forehead against the cold metal wall as he roughly positioned me. "By not giving you what you want." He cursed, a vile stream of words, and then there was only the violence of the act itself. It was a collision, hard, fast, and devoid of any tenderness. He drove into me with the desperate fury of a man trying to outrun his own demons. It was meant to be degrading, a stark reminder of his power and my helplessness. But I didn't feel helpless. Every thrust drove me harder against the unforgiving metal wall, bruising my spine, scraping my skin. The mud squelched beneath our feet. The smells of dirt, sweat, and blood mingled in the humid air. I didn't make a sound. I bit the inside of my cheek until copper filled my mouth, refusing to give him a cry of pain, refusing to give him a moan of submission. I locked my muscles, meeting his aggression with an immovable, stony resistance. I was a statue he was trying to shatter. The friction between us wasn't just physical, it was that energy again. With every point of contact, the hidden fire inside me surged against his skin. It was a mutual torment. I could feel his muscles twitching, spasming where he held me, his body fighting the unnatural sensation even as he forced himself on me. It was agony. It was a perverse, searing connection that burned away everything else. The slums, the castle, the council. There was only the dark, the mud, and this hateful electric battle. His breath became ragged, guttural. He was losing control, the beast taking over completely. His grip on my waist became punishing. "Tell me what you are," he gasped against my ear, his voice strained tight with exertion and something else. Confusion, desperation. "Why do you burn?" I am nothing, I gritted out, thrusting back against him with all the meager strength I had, refusing to just be a receptacle for his rage. I am the void you hate. The climax when it came was violent. He cried out a harsh, angry sound, his body bowing against mine, driving deep and holding there, shuddering with release. At that exact moment, the leash inside me snapped again. Just for a second. A pulse of raw, green energy flared outward from my core. It was silent, invisible in the dark, but it hit him like a physical blow. He gasped, his entire body jerking violently as if he'd touched a live wire. His head snapped back, his blindfolded face angled toward the rusted ceiling of the shack. For a heartbeat, the air in the hovel didn't just taste like ozone, it hummed with power. Then it was gone. I clamped down on it, shoving the genie back into its bottle with a mental fortitude that left me trembling. Damien slumped against me, his heavy breathing loud in the sudden silence. He didn't move away immediately, he stayed there, pressing me into the wall, his heart hammering against my back like a war drum. He had felt it. He had seen it again, in whatever broken way his brain processed the world. He pulled back slowly, the separation cold and sticky. He stood behind me, readjusting his clothes. I remained facing the wall, my forehead resting against the cool metal, my own breath hitching in my chest. I could feel the blood trickling down my leg, mixing with the mud. He didn't say a word. He didn't threaten me. He didn't strike me. He just turned and walked out into the night, leaving me alone in the wreckage of the shack, the smell of his fury and our violent collision hanging heavy in the air. I slid down the wall until I was sitting in the mud again. I wrapped my arms around my knees, shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, aching soreness. I hadn't broken, but I had let him see the lightning again, and this time, I knew he wouldn't be able to ignore it. The hunt had just changed direction.
The water in the basin was scalding, steaming into the cool morning air of my chambers. I scrubbed my skin until it turned raw and red, using a harsh lye soap meant for laborers, not alphas. It didn't help. I couldn't wash the outer ring off me. The stench of mud and rust was gone, but the phantom sensation of her remained. It was burned into my palms, coated my tongue, thrummed in the marrow of my bones. I stepped out of the bath, dripping onto the cold stone floor. I didn't reach for a towel immediately. I stood perfectly still in the center of the sprawling room, breathing, listening. The castle was waking up. I heard the distant clang of pots in the kitchens 5 floors down. I heard the rhythmic, heavy tread of the changing guard on the outer wall, a mile away. I heard a mouse scratching behind the wainscoting in the far corner of the room. It was too loud. It was all too sharp. For more than 20 years, my world had been a muddled soup of echolocation and heightened smell, a constant struggle to map the darkness. It was like navigating through thick fog. This morning, the fog had lifted. I turned my head toward the heavy wardrobe across the room. I couldn't see it. My eyes were still useless pits of scar tissue hidden behind silk, but I knew exactly where it was. I could sense its density, its shape displacing the air. The sonic feedback from my own breath bouncing off its surface painted a crisp, 3-dimensional outline in my mind. I walked toward it, not with the cautious, sweeping gait I had perfected over years, but in a straight, unwavering line. I stopped an inch before my toes hit the wood. I reached out and touched the carved handle, exactly where I knew it would be. My breath hitched in my throat. A tremor ran through my hand. It was her. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, staggering me back a step. Last night in the mud, the violence of it, the hateful necessity of breaking her against that wall. At the apex of it, when I was lost to the beast and she was fighting me with that impossible silent rigidity, something had happened. A jolt, a shockwave of raw, vibrating heat that had nothing to do with friction and everything to do with the lightning I had sensed trapped under her skin. It had blasted through me, terrifying and agonizing. And in that split second, the eternal static in my head had cleared. For a heartbeat, I hadn't just sensed the shack around us. I had perceived it in blinding, terrifying detail. The clarity had faded as soon as I left her. but it hadn't gone back to the old normal. The baseline had shifted. I leaned against the stone wall, my wet hair dripping onto my shoulders. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. The descendant of the people who blinded me was the only thing that had ever brought a flicker of sight back. It was perverse. It was disgusting. And I wanted more. The rage I felt for her bloodline, for the secret she kept, was still a roaring furnace in my chest. I wanted to crush her for what her ancestors did to me. But alongside that hatred, a new dark obsession was taking root. She was a drug, a poisonous, hateful drug that made the darkness recede. The council lied. The thought solidified, cold and hard. They sold her as useless human refuse, a spiteful gift. But you don't wrap lightning in human skin by accident. If she was just a human from the slums, why did her touch burn? Why did her presence create a void that defied my senses? Why did rutting with her act like a defibrillator to my atrophied optic nerves? They knew. They had to know. I dressed quickly, jerky and angry movements. I didn't bother with the ceremonial robes the council preferred. I pulled on durable leathers, clothes meant for hunting, for work. I wasn't going back to the outer ring. Not yet. I needed to understand the weapon before I picked it up again. I left my chambers, ignoring the bowing guards who reeked of fear at my approach. I descended into the bowels of the castle, past the dungeons to the archives. It was a place alphas rarely went. The air down here was dry and choked with the dust of centuries of parchment and vellum. It smelled of dead words and buried secrets. The elderly human scribe staffing the desk nearly swallowed his tongue when I loomed over his desk. He smelled like old paper and terror. "My Lord Alpha," he squeaked, scrambling to his feet, knocking over an inkwell. How may I serve?" "The histories," I said, my voice echoing flatly in the cavernous, silent room. "The unfiltered records from 25 years ago, specifically the campaign at Miller's Creek and the subsequent plague that winter." The scribe froze. "My lord, those records are sealed by order of the High Council. Only sanitized summaries are available for—" I leaned across the desk. I didn't growl. I didn't need to. I just let my aura, heavy with the violence of the previous night, wash over him. "Do I look like I want a summary?" I whispered. He trembled so hard his glasses slid down his nose. I will retrieve the keys, Alpha, immediately." He scurried away into the dark stacks. I waited in the silence, listening to the scurrying of rats and the thud of my own heart. The clarity was still there. I could sense the rows upon rows of shelves, the sheer weight of the knowledge buried here. When the scribe returned, his hands shaking uncontrollably, he laid a heavy, leather-bound tome on the desk. It was mildewed and smelled faintly of smoke. "Read," I commanded. "Start with the healer's reports from the winter after the creek fell. Look for anomalies, anything they couldn't explain." He flipped pages with trembling fingers, his voice cracking as he began to read dry reports of fever and blindness. Minutes passed, then hours. It was mostly bureaucratic nonsense. Then he stopped. He swallowed hard. "Keep going," I said. "This is a notation from head healer Vane, dated the 3rd week of the plague." He cleared his throat nervously. "The degradation of the optic nerve in the subjects is not consistent with viral pathology. The tissue isn't diseased, it's withered, burned out from the inside. There are traces of residual energy signatures in the blood work that defy classification. It resembles—" He stopped again. The silence stretched taut. "Resembles what, scribe?" He crossed it out, my lord, but faintly underneath it looks like he wrote Fey interference. The temperature in the archive seemed to drop 20 degrees. Fey, the boogeymen of our history, creatures of pure magic that we supposedly hunted to extinction centuries ago, because their very existence was anathema to our physical dominance. "Keep reading," I said, my voice ice. "There's a marginal note from a council member. It says, 'Suppress this. The pack cannot know we are vulnerable to ghosts. Classify as a pathogen. Burn the source at Miller's Creek again, just to be sure.'" I stood up slowly. The chair scrapped loudly against the stone floor. They knew. For 25 years they had known it wasn't sickness. It was magic. An ancient enemy they claimed to have destroyed had reached out from the grave and crippled their alpha. And now they had dropped a descendant of that enemy right into my lap. Why? To finish the job? Or did they think I was so broken, so obsessed with my own misery, that I wouldn't notice the lightning trapped in the jar? I turned away from the trembling scribe. The darkness was still there, but the map in my head was burning bright. "Leave the book," I said. "If you speak of this to anyone, I will know." I walked out of the archives, ascending back toward the light. The rage was a cold, calculating thing now. Irene wasn't just a victim of my father's war, she was a bomb, and I was the only one who knew how to trigger her. The midday sun beat down on the outer ring, baking the mud into a hard, cracked crust that reeked of sewage and decay. I walked through it, not with the drunken fury of the previous night, but with a cold, terrifying precision. The clarity I had gained in the archives hadn't faded. The world was sharper now. The chaotic noise of the slums was distinct. Separate heartbeats, individual whispers of fear, the exact location of a rusted hinge squeaking 3 alleys over. I didn't crash through the slum this time. I cut through it like a scalpel. The guards at the perimeter fence saw me coming and scrambled to kill the power, practically ripping the gate off its hinges to let me pass. They smelled of paralyzing terror. They were used to a brooding, angry alpha they could manage with deference. They didn't know what to do with the icy, focused predator walking past them now. I went straight to the eastern edge, to the silence. The tin shack was exactly as I had left it. Door hanging by a thread, the jagged hole in the wall gaping like a wound. I stepped inside. The air was still heavy with the copper scent of blood and the musk of our violence. She was sitting in the corner, knees drawn up, staring at nothing. She looked wrecked. Her dress was torn, stained with mud and dried blood. There were bruises darkening on her arms where I had gripped her. But her eyes, when they snapped to mine, were clear. There was no broken victim in that gaze, just wariness and an ancient, simmering hatred. "Back for another round, Wolf?" she rasped. Her voice was rough, throat raw. "Did you finish breaking things?" I didn't move toward her. I stood in the center of the hovel, letting the unnatural silence she generated wash over me. It was no longer just irritating, it was a clue, a fingerprint. "Get up," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of the snarl I usually reserved for her. She didn't move. "I'm comfortable right here, among the refuse, thanks." "You no longer refuse," I said, taking a step closer. The air crackled between us, an invisible pressure change that made my ears pop. "You are evidence." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Evidence of what? Your brutality?" "Of a 25-year-old lie." I reached down, offering a hand. She looked at it as if it were a viper coiled to strike. When she didn't take it, I reached down and gripped her upper arm. The jolt was immediate. It wasn't the overwhelming blast from last night, but a steady, low-voltage hum that raced up my arm and settled at the base of my skull. The static in my head cleared another fraction. The outline of the shack became razor-sharp in my mind. She hissed at the contact, trying to jerk away, but I held fast. "Come with me," I commanded, pulling her to her feet. She stumbled, favoring her left leg, But I didn't slow down. I dragged her out of the shack, out of the mud, and back toward the glittering sterile towers of the inner keep. The walk back was a gauntlet of shocked silence. Pack members, guards, servants, they all stopped and stared as their blind alpha hauled a filthy, battered human woman out of the slums and through the main gates. I didn't care. Their whispers were just noise. The only thing that mattered was the live wire gripped in my hand. I didn't take her to the dungeons. I took her up. Up the spiraling stairs of the central tower, past the guest wings, past the council chambers, all the way to the eyrie at the top, my private sanctuary. No one entered these rooms but me. They smelled only of leather, old wood, and my own solitary brooding. I threw open the heavy oak door and pulled her inside, kicking it shut behind us. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the vast, quiet space. I released her arm. The loss of contact was physically jarring, like stepping out of a warm room into a blizzard. The world went slightly fuzzy at the edges again, the map in my head losing its hyper-definition. She stumbled to the center of the room, looking around wildly. Her presence was a stain on the sterile environment, a smudge of mud and blood on polished stone floors and priceless rugs. "Why am I here?" she demanded, spinning to face me. She looked small against the oversized furniture, but her posture was rigid defiance. "What game is this, Damien?" I walked past her to a side table and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. I needed something to dull the sudden sensory withdrawal. "It's no game, Irene," I said, tasting her name. It felt weighty now, significant. "It's a reevaluation of assets." I held a glass out to her. She stared at it, then at the blindfold covering my eyes. "Poison?" she asked dryly. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't need poison." She hesitated, then snatched the glass. She didn't drink. She just held it like a weapon. I took a long swallow of my own, letting the burn settle in my chest. I leaned against the heavy oak table, crossing my arms. I couldn't see her face, but I could hear her rapid, shallow breathing. I could smell the spike of adrenaline cutting through the grime on her skin. "I went to the archives this morning," I said casually. Her breath hitched. Just a fraction of a second, but I heard it. "I'm sure the dust was fascinating," she said, her voice tight. "It was informative. I read the unfiltered reports on Miller's Creek and the sickness that followed." The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't just her void now. It was a heavy, suffocating tension. "I know what you are, Irene," I lied softly. I didn't know exactly what she was, but I knew what she wasn't. "I'm a human woman whose family your father murdered," she said, sticking to the script, but the conviction was brittle. "No," I said, pushing off the table and walking slowly toward her. I stopped inches away, invading her space, letting my size dwarf her. "Humans die when we break them. Humans don't burn when you touch them. Humans don't carry an energy signature that terrified the High Council so much they buried the truth for a quarter of a century." I leaned down, my voice dropping to a whisper near her ear. "They called it Fey interference." She didn't move. She didn't breathe. It was as if she had turned to stone. "The council thinks you're a sick joke," I murmured, inhaling the scentless air around her neck, feeling the radiant heat of the power she was holding back. "They think they bound me to a pathetic human remnant to humiliate me." I pulled back just enough to face her, though I couldn't see her expression. "But they didn't give me a punishment, did they, little poisoner?" I said, a dark, cold smile spreading across my face for the first time in years. "They gave me a bomb."
The high tower room, the Alpha's personal eyrie, was a gilded cage. It smelled of polished wood, ancient leather, and the suffocating, omnipresent scent of Damien, a mix of deep forest ozone and the coppery tang of the violence that seemed to simmer just beneath his skin. He hadn't let me leave since dragging me back from the slums yesterday. He hadn't touched me again, Not sexually, but the air between us was thicker than blood. He treated me like a volatile chemical he was studying in a lab. He watched me, truly watched me, his head tracking my movements with eerie precision even through that black silk blindfold. He knows, I whispered to myself, standing by the narrow, arrow-slit window, looking down at the sprawling estate hundreds of feet below. He didn't know everything. He thought I was a weapon of the Fae, a remnant of an old war. He didn't know I was Fae. He didn't know that the bomb he claimed to possess was actually a living, breathing highborn of the summer court, bound in a human meat suit, sent to burn his legacy to the ground. But he was getting too close. The way his senses sharpened around me, the way my own magic buzzed uncontrollably against my skin whenever he drew near, it was unsustainable. My glamour was fraying at the edges, worn thin by stress and the constant and draining effort of suppression. I needed to escape before the cracks became fissures. The heavy oak door swung open. Damien didn't enter. He stood in the threshold, radiating that restless, manic energy that had consumed him since the archives. "Come," he said. It wasn't a request. I turned slowly. To the dungeon, or back to the mud? "Outside," he clipped out. "The perimeter." He held out his hand. It was a command to be leashed. I crossed the room, my movements stiff. When I placed my hand in his, the familiar jolt zipped up my arm. He inhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring, and I saw the tension leave his shoulders as the static in his head cleared. He needed the fix. I was his seeing-eye dog, and I hated him for it almost as much as I hated myself for the traitorous shiver that ran down my spine at his touch. We descended the tower in silence. He moved fast, pulling me along, navigating the winding stairs with a terrifying new confidence. We didn't head toward the main gates or the populated areas. We went out a side postern, heading toward the dense, primeval forest that formed the northern boundary of the werewolf estate. This was the edge of their civilized brutality. The manicured lawns gave way to untamed undergrowth. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and the ancient secrets of the wood. Damien let go of my hand but stayed close, his head tilted, sampling the wind. "Different," he muttered, almost to himself. "The trees. I can hear the sap moving. I can smell a deer bedded down 300 yards north-northeast." He turned his blindfolded face toward me, a chilling grin spreading across his face. "It's loud, Irene. The world is so loud when you're near." "I'm thrilled to be of service," I said dryly, hugging my arms to my chest. The Fae energy was roiling inside me, reacting to the proximity of the ancient forest. It wanted to answer the call of the wild magic dormant in the roots and soil. Holding it in was physically painful, a pressure building behind my eyes. "Stay here," he commanded suddenly, his head snapping toward the east. "Don't move an inch. If you run, I will hear you before your foot leaves the ground." A low growl ripped from his throat, and then he blurred. He didn't shift into his wolf form, but he moved with supernatural speed, disappearing into the dense shadows of the trees toward whatever perimeter breach had caught his heightened attention. I was alone. I stood still for a moment, the silence of the woods pressing in. This was my chance. I could run. I could drop the glamour, let the magic loose, and tear a path through the trees to freedom. But before I could even take a breath to center myself, the wind shifted. The clean scent of pine was overwhelmed by something cloying, heavy floral perfume trying desperately to mask the sour tang of jealousy and rotting meat. I turned slowly. 3 wolves emerged from the tree line behind me. They were in human form, but they prowled. In the lead was a woman I recognized from the initial presentation ceremony. She was stunning in a brittle, manufactured way. Platinum blonde hair coiled in elaborate braids, ice blue eyes that held nothing but cruelty, and a silk gown that looked ridiculous against the forest backdrop. Celine, the maid of the council's second in command, a high-born bitch who wore her status like armor. Flanking her were 2 male enforcers, hulking brutes with flat eyes who reeked of obedience and stupid violence. Celine stopped 10 feet away, looking me up and down with an expression of profound disgust, as if I were something unpleasant she'd stepped in. "So," she drawled, her voice a silken whip, "this is the pet the Alpha keeps in his tower?" I didn't speak. I kept my posture rigid, my face blank. The pressure inside me was mounting. Damien was just out of earshot, but these 3, they were right here. "Silence does not become a slave," Celine spat, taking a step closer. "Do you know who I am, human trash?" "A woman wandering too close to the Alpha's property," I said quietly. Her eyes narrowed to slits. The insult landed. She motioned with a manicured hand to the 2 brutes behind her. "Property? She laughed, a harsh barking sound. You are a stain, a mistake the council made to humble Damien, but he seems to have forgotten his place. Allowing a mud grubber like you into the Eyrie, it insults the very stones of this estate. She wasn't here on council orders. This was personal. This was a high-ranking female offended that a piece of human cattle was occupying a space she likely coveted for herself. Grab her, Celine ordered, her voice dropping to a growl. The two males moved instantly. I tensed to fight back, my human combat training kicking in, but they were too fast and too strong. One grabbed my left arm, twisting it behind my back with bone-creaking force. The other grabbed a fistful of my hair, yanking my head back until my neck screamed in protest. I bit my tongue to keep from crying out. The pain was sharp, grounding. It helped focus the chaotic energy threatening to burst out of me. You think you're special because the cripple bathes you and lets you sleep on his floor? Celine sneered, walking up to where I was held helpless. She reached out and traced a razor-sharp fingernail down my cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. He just likes broken things. It makes him feel less pathetic. She leaned in close, her floral perfume suffocating me. He's busy right now. A little distraction I arranged, she whispered, her hot breath on my face. By the time he gets back, I'm going to make sure you know exactly what you are. She nodded toward the deeper woods, away from the path Damien had taken. Take her into the shadows, Celine commanded the enforcers. Let's see how much noise the little mouse makes when we really start to play. The world became a blur of green and brown shadows, rushing past as I was hauled backward through the underbrush. My feet barely touched the ground. The two brutes gripped me with strength that wasn't just lupin, it was engineered for crushing. One hand was a vice on my bicep, fingers digging deep enough to bruise bone. The other was tangled in my hair, yanking my scalp so hard my vision swam with black spots. I didn't scream. Screaming was for victims who believed someone might save them. No one was coming. Damien was chasing shadows 3 miles away, delayed by whatever scent Celine had planted. The fey magic inside me was a screaming siren now, a blinding white noise battering against the fragile walls of my glamour. It recognized the mortal danger even if my human mind was still trying to process the sudden violence. Release, it whispered. Burn them. I bit my tongue until I tasted copper, using the sharp sting to anchor myself. Not yet. If I broke cover now, I was dead anyway. The council would hunt me down before I made it to the perimeter fence. They dragged me into a small, dark clearing choked with thorns and ancient ferns. The air here was stagnant, smelling of damp rot and the overwhelming, cloying scent of Celine's arousal. Not sexual, but the thrill of a predator about to toy with its food. The enforcers threw me down. I hit the root-snarled ground hard and the breath knocked out of me. Before I could scramble up, a heavy boot slammed into the center of my back, pinning me to the earth. I craned my neck, looking up. Celine stood over me, silhouetted against the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. She looked monstrous, her beautiful features twisted into a mask of pure, elite hatred. Look at you, she sneered, nudging my ribs with the toe of her expensive boot. Crawling in the dirt where you belong. Do you think Damien sees this? Does he see the pathetic little worm beneath the rags? He sees more than you ever will, I rasped, dirt gritting between my teeth. Her eyes flashed a dangerous, inhuman yellow. He sees what I allow him to see. And right now, I'm going to make sure he sees that his new toy is broken beyond repair. She gestured sharply to the guards. Hold her up, on her knees. The weight left my back, but instantly rough hands grabbed my shoulders, hauling me onto my knees. They held my arms wrenched behind my back, forcing my chest forward, exposing my throat. Celine stepped closer. The smell of her was suffocating, perfume struggling to mask the musk of an apex predator, shivering with anticipation. She didn't look like a civilized member of the council's court anymore. She looked feral. You humans, she hissed, leaning down until her face was inches from mine. You think you have dignity. You think you matter. Her hand shot out, gripping my jaw, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my cheeks like talons. You're just meat, something to be used and discarded. She began to lower herself, her intent becoming sickeningly clear. It wasn't about desire, it was about erasure. It was about taking the Alpha's property and defiling it in the most primal way possible to prove that I was beneath consideration, beneath humanity. Open your mouth, pet, she whispered, her voice a guttural purr. Show me what a good little slave you are. Beg me to let you serve your betters. The degradation hit me harder than the physical blows. The sheer, vile arrogance of it, the pressure inside my chest, the contained supernova of my heritage rammed against my ribs. My heart hammered against the cage of my glamour. "Let us out!" the ancient voices screamed. "She is dust beneath our feet." I looked straight into Celine's yellowing eyes. I saw the madness there, the absolute belief in her own supremacy. "No," I said. It wasn't a shout, it was a flat, dead sound, harder than granite. Celine froze. For a second, she looked genuinely confused, as if her furniture had just spoken back to her. Then her face contorted. The human mask shattered completely, her lips peeled back from her teeth in a grotesque snarl, revealing canines that were lengthening, sharpening right in front of my eyes. A deep, terrifying growl ripped from her chest, vibrating through the hand that still gripped my jaw. "You filthy little—" She didn't finish the insult. The pretense of humiliation vanished, replaced instantly by the blinding, hot urge to kill. Her grip on my face shifted, moving down to my throat. Her claws punctured the skin of my neck. I felt a hot trickle of blood immediately. I couldn't breathe. The edges of my vision turned gray. Celine leaned in, her jaws opening wide, her hot, rancid breath washing over my face. She was going to rip my throat out. The gray in my vision turned white. The choice was gone. Survive as Fae, or die as a human. The pressure behind my eyes broke, the dam shattered. Burn. Bing! The transition wasn't gradual. There was no slow fade from human weakness to eldritch power. It was a violent, agonizing rupture. One moment, I was a suffocating human woman, my windpipe compressing under the lethal pressure of a werewolf's claws, the stench of her rancid breath filling my nose. The next, the cage of my own making disintegrated. The glamour didn't just dissolve, it shattered outward like tempered glass struck by a hammer. Years of suppression, of binding spells, woven tight against my own skin, snapped simultaneously. The backlash was blinding pain, a searing heat that started in my marrow and erupted through every pore. The world went white, not with light, but with pure, unadulterated energy. The first thing that changed was the sound. The forest didn't go quiet, the sound was sucked out of it. The rustle of leaves, the heavy breathing of the enforcers, Celine's guttural growls, it all vanished into a terrifying, absolute vacuum. Time seemed to stretch, warp. I wasn't choking anymore. The need for air felt like a distant mortal concern that no longer applied to me. My eyes snapped open. The gray fog was gone. The world was crystal clear, rendered in hyper-reality. I saw the individual pores on Celine's snarling face. I saw the pulse hammering in her temple, thick with adrenaline and hatred, and I saw the aura surrounding her, a muddy, violent red smear that paled in comparison to the sun that was rising inside my own chest. She must have seen it too. The murderous triumph in her yellow eyes curdled into sudden, primal confusion, then abject terror. Her claws stopped digging into my neck. She tried to pull back, her instinct recognizing a predator far older and more dangerous than herself. Too late. My hands moved without conscious thought, guided by muscle memory that predated the century. They weren't human hands anymore. They burned with an emerald fire, the skin translucent, revealing veins flowing with molten gold. I reached up and gripped Celine's face. My thumbs dug into her cheeks just below her eyes, my fingers curled under her jawline. Her skin sizzled where I touched it. The magic didn't explode, it didn't roar, it was surgical. It flowed from my palms into her flesh, seeking calcium, seeking structure. Celine tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as I pushed. It wasn't a contest of strength, it was matter versus antimatter. Under my glowing fingers, her jawbone didn't break, it dissolved. The rigid structure of her mandible turned to chalk dust instantly beneath her skin. The sound was sickening, a wet, muffled crunch followed by a dry hiss as bone disintegrated. Her face collapsed inward. The lower half of her beautiful, cruel visage became a shapeless sack of ruined flesh hanging slack against her neck. She went limp with shock, her body forgetting how to stand. I let her go. She dropped like a stone at my knees, a gurgling, choked sound escaping the ruin of her mouth. The two enforcers holding my arms finally reacted to the silent horror unfolding in front of them. They tried to jerk me back, to break my arms, but they were gripping a statue made of starfire. I stood up, dragging them with me as if they were weightless children. The vacuum broke. The sound rushed back into the clearing with a deafening roar, the wind shrieking, the trees groaning as if in pain. I didn't look at the guards. I just flexed my will outward. A concussion blast of raw, unfiltered summer court energy erupted from my core. It was a physical wall of emerald light and kinetic force. It hit the two wolves chest high. There was a sickening thud of impact like a high-speed collision. They were lifted off their feet and thrown backward through the air, crashing through thick underbrush and slamming into ancient oak trees 20 feet away with bone-shattering force. They slid to the ground and didn't move. Silence returned to the clearing, heavier than before. I stood alone in the center of the devastation. The emerald fire on my hands pulsed, hungry for more, urging me to burn the forest down to turn the soil to glass. I looked down at Celine. She was curled in a fetal position in the dirt, clutching her destroyed face, making pathetic, wet, whimpering noises. She was alive, broken, permanently disfigured, but alive. A wave of dizziness hit me so hard the world tilted on its axis. The sudden expenditure of so much power after years of starvation was too much. The fire on my skin sputtered and died. The vibrant colors of the fey vision faded back to dull mortal sight. My knees buckled. I hit the ground hard right next to the woman who had tried to unmake me. The coppery taste of blood was back in my mouth. Darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, heavy and irresistible. As consciousness slipped away, I had one terrifying final thought. He will know.
The forest hadn't just gone quiet. It had ceased to exist. One moment I was tearing through the dense underbrush 3 miles east of the castle, following a scent trail that I now realized was a pathetic, manufactured decoy. I was furious, my wolf pacing just beneath my skin, enraged that Celine had dared to interfere with what was mine. The next moment, the world ended. It wasn't a sound. It was a psychic concussion, a pressure wave so immense it felt like the atmosphere had suddenly compressed to the density of lead. It hit me with the physical force of a wrecking ball, knocking the air from my lungs and bringing me to my knees in the dirt. The constant irritating static that had filled my dead visual cortex since childhood didn't just spike, it supernovaed. White-hot agony seared behind my blindfold. For a terrifying second, I thought I was back in Miller's Creek, an 8-year-old boy screaming as the world went dark. Then the smell hit me. It punched through the loam and pine, drowning out everything else. It was the scent of ozone just after a lightning strike, the smell of burning sugar and something ancient, metallic and terrifyingly powerful. Magic. Real magic. Not the hedge witch nonsense some humans dabbled in. This was the kind of power that cracked tectonic plates. And it smelled exactly like Irene. The realization hit me harder than the psychic shockwave. The air rushed back into my lungs in a ragged gasp. I was on my feet before my conscious mind could process the movement, abandoning the decoy trail, turning toward the source of that cataclysmic eruption. I ran. I didn't bother dodging trees. I shoulder-checked oaks thick enough to stop a truck, snapping saplings like twigs. My hearing, usually my primary navigation tool, was useless. A high-pitched whine drowned out the forest sounds. I navigated solely by that terrifying, intoxicating scent of burning power. I burst into the clearing. The air here was 20 degrees hotter than the surrounding woods. It tasted like copper and ash. My senses, usually a finely tuned orchestra, were a cacophony of violence. I smelled wolf blood, too much of it. I smelled the pungent, bitter reek of abject terror. I heard the wet, gurgling breaths of things that were broken and dying. Celine, I growled, the name tasting foul. I could smell her perfume, now mixed with the sickening odor of pulverized bone. She was on the ground to my left, alive, but ruined. 2 of her enforcers were heaped piles further back, their heartbeats sluggish, their bodies radiating the trauma of a massive impact. I didn't care. They were pack, but in that moment, they were just debris. I turned my head toward the center of the clearing, toward the epicenter of the blast, toward her. And for the first time in 20 years, I saw. The static behind my eyes didn't clear. It was incinerated. I couldn't see the trees. I couldn't see the ground. I couldn't see the sky. I only saw the sun. She lay crumpled on the scorched earth, unconscious. But she wasn't the small, unassuming human woman I had dragged out of the slums. She was a blazing, terrifying silhouette of emerald fire and molten gold. The aura poured off her limp body in waves, a sheer naked energy so intense it felt like staring into a blast furnace. It was beautiful. It was horrifying. It was the most dangerous thing I had ever perceived. My knees almost buckled again. The lie of it crushed me. The useless mate, the defiant human slave, the fragile little creature I had pinned against a wall, whose heart I had listened to beat with a steady, stubborn rhythm. Every second of it had been a performance, a deception of staggering magnitude. She wasn't prey. She was a predator so ancient that my own species was a footnote in her history. She was a bomb wrapped in human skin, and I had been sleeping next to the detonator. I walked toward her. The heat coming off her body was incredible. As I got closer, the blinding visual intensity faded slightly, as her consciousness ebbed, but the humming energy beneath her skin remained. I knelt in the dirt beside her. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, not with fear, but with an adrenaline overdose that felt like a heart attack. When my fingers brushed the skin of her arm, the jolt wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a lightning strike that traveled straight up my arm and fused into my spine. My vision, my actual vision, through the dead eyes beneath the linen, flickered with impossible shapes and colors before settling back into the blinding emerald outline of her form. I scooped her up. She was dead weight, limp and vulnerable in my arms, yet holding her felt like carrying a dormant nuclear warhead. I stood up, clutching her tight against my chest. The scent of her, that void-like absence mixed with this new, terrifying ozone, filled my nose. Behind me, Celine let out a pathetic, wet whimper. I didn't turn around. I didn't offer aid. If she died here, it was less than she deserved for nearly triggering the apocalypse on my land. I began walking back toward the castle, not toward the slave quarters, not toward the dungeons. I carried the greatest lie ever told straight to the highest tower in the estate, to my eyrie, to the only place strong enough to hold her when she woke up. Because when she woke up, the interrogation wasn't going to be about defiance. It was going to be about war. The eyrie reeked of ozone and ancient dust. It was a smell that didn't belong in werewolf's den. It belonged in a thunderstorm or the aftermath of an explosion. I sat in the heavy oak chair facing the bed, perfectly still. The blindfold was still tied around my head, a useless rag of habit. I didn't need it anymore, not when I looked at her. Irene lay on the mattress where I had dumped her hours ago. I had chained her, not with the standard leather restraints I might use on a disobedient pack female, but with cold forged iron shackles bolted directly into the stone floor, thick enough to anchor a raging alpha. They looked ridiculously overkill against her slender, unconscious wrists. Another lie. Through the linen of my blindfold, the room was the usual sickening wash of gray static, except for the bed. The bed was a bonfire. Even unconscious, drained from the cataclysm she had unleashed in the woods, she burned. A blazing silhouette of emerald fire and molten gold radiated from her small frame, so bright it made my dormant optic nerves ache. It was terrifying. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I had spent weeks thinking I was breaking a defiant human pet. In reality, I had been sleeping next to a dormant god. She stirred. The golden light of her aura flared, pulsing with returning consciousness. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the arms of the chair until the wood groaned. The wolf inside me was howling, a confused mix of rabid territorial aggression and abject primal fear. Her eyes opened. For a second, I saw the human mask slip back into place, the brown eyes, the confusion. Then she felt the weight of the iron at her wrists and ankles. She saw me sitting there, watching her. The mask evaporated. The eyes that met mine weren't brown anymore. They were the color of old moss and high summer leaves, ancient and utterly devoid of human warmth. She didn't scream. She didn't thrash against the chains. She just looked at me, then down at the iron cuffs, and let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dried leaves skittering over gravestones. "A bit dramatic, Damien," she said. Her voice had changed too. The slight tremor of the human victim was gone, replaced by a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the stones of the tower. "Iron? Really? You think this holds me if I don't wish to be held?" It held Selene's face together while you turned her jawbone to dust, I said, my voice a low rumble. I stood up and walked toward the bed. The heat coming off her was palpable now, a dry, static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Every step closer brought that agonizing, addictive clarity to my vision. "What are you?" I demanded, stopping 2 feet from her. She sat up slowly, the chains rattling. She looked at me with an expression that chilled my blood. It was pity. "I am what your kind used to fear before you forgot your own history books," she said calmly, "before you decided you were the apex predators of this world." "Fae," I spat the word. It tasted like ashes, the nursery rhyme monsters, the reason for my blindness. "Highborn of the summer court, if we're being specific," she corrected, tilting her head. "Not that the distinction matters to a wolf." The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I already knew it. Hearing her say it, seeing the arrogant tilt of her chin, the sheer power rolling off her in waves, it recontextualized everything. "Why?" I snarled, fighting the urge to back away from the sheer radioactive presence of her. "Why play the slave? Why let the council humiliate you? You could have leveled this castle the day you arrived." "Destruction is vulgar," she murmured, looking around my room with distaste. "And inefficient. My mission wasn't to destroy the estate, Damien. It was to rot it." She looked back at me, those ancient green eyes boring into mine. I was sent to be the wrench in the gears, the pathetic human mate that would make the broken alpha finally snap, or make the council overplay their hand trying to get rid of me. I was supposed to be the catalyst for a civil war that would tear your pack apart from the inside out, so we wouldn't have to waste precious energy doing it ourselves. She paused, a cruel little smile touching her lips. "And you were doing so well, so angry, so predictable." The humiliation was a cold knife in my gut. I had been dancing on her strings since the moment I smelled her in the throne room. My rage, my defiance of the council, my obsession with her, all calculated by her kind. But then another thought struck me, harder and colder than the first. My mind replayed the last few weeks in agonizing detail. The moment in the shack when I shoved her against the wall, the times I'd grabbed her throat to intimidate her, the night in the slums, against the rough wood of the cabin wall, when I had taken her with everything I had, driven by madness and hatred. I had thrust into her, bitten her, used her body to sate my own fury. I remembered her small hands flat against the wall, her silence, the way she absorbed my violence. I thought I was dominating a resilient human. My blood ran cold. The realization nearly brought me to my knees. "In the cabin," I whispered, the words strangling me. When we fought." Her expression didn't change. She knew exactly where my mind had gone. "You could have killed me," I said, the horror dawning fully, "at any moment, when I grabbed you, when I forced you." "Yes," she said simply. "You could have vaporized me." "Easily." "Why didn't you?" I roared, the sound tearing from my chest, the idea that my dominance had been an illusion, that she had allowed me to touch her, allowed me to use her, to maintain her cover. It was an emasculation so profound, it eclipsed everything the council had ever done to me. "Because you were useful," she said coldly, "and because, curiously, your proximity, It isn't unpleasant. Your energy is chaotic, but it feeds something in mine. She leaned forward against the chains, the emerald fire flaring brighter, illuminating the grim lines of my face. Do not mistake my tolerance for weakness, Wolf. I endured you because it suited my purpose, and because I knew that every time you touched me, a little piece of my magic was bleeding into you, fixing that broken wiring in your brain. She gestured vaguely to my blindfold. You see me now, don't you? The real me. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by the inversion of our reality. I wasn't the alpha holding a dangerous purchase in my tower. I was locked in a room with a nuclear weapon that I had been foolish enough to fuck. So, Irene said softly, the chains clinking as she settled back against the pillows, looking every inch the queen on a throne of lies. Now that you know I'm not your pet, Damien, what are you going to do with me? The question hung in the air between us, heavier than the scent of ozone and ancient lies. What are you going to do with me? I stared at the creature wearing Irene's face. The sheer atomic weight of her presence in my sanctuary was making it hard to breathe. Every instinct I had as a wolf screamed at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this apex predator I had foolishly chained to my floor. But the man, the broken, bitter man who had finally been given the gift of sight, couldn't look away from the terrible beauty of her true form. I didn't get a chance to answer. My ears, already straining under the pressure of the silence in the room, picked up the sound first. Heavy boots on stone stairs, many of them. They were moving fast, ascending the tower with a singular, aggressive purpose. The scent hit me seconds later, seeping under the heavy oak door. It was a thick, cloying miasma of alpha pheromones, self-righteous fury, and the metallic tang of fresh blood on armor. The council. Irene's head tilted toward the door. Her expression didn't change, but the emerald flames of her aura flared brighter, a silent surge of readiness. It seems, she said, her voice practically vibrating in my skull, your masters have come to collect their property. My jaw tightened so hard I thought a tooth might crack. They aren't my masters. Aren't they? She raised a delicate eyebrow. They broke you, blinded you, and gave you to me as a joke. You've done nothing but dance to their tune, Damien. I wanted to roar at her. I wanted to wrap my hands around her throat again, just to prove I still could, even knowing it was suicidal. The shame of her words burned hotter than her magic. The pounding on the door was loud enough to shake dust from the high rafters. Damien, the voice belonged to Marcus, the eldest of the council, a vile old wolf whose fur was thinning, but whose capacity for cruelty hadn't diminished with age. Open this door, now. I looked at Irene one last time. She was just watching me, an immortal queen waiting to see what her temporary jailer would do. I turned and stalked to the door. I didn't open it fully. I cracked it just enough to block the entrance with my body. The hallway beyond was a swirling gray fog of my damaged vision, but the scents were distinct. Marcus was in the lead, flanked by 4 of his personal guard, massive brutes bred for obedience and violence. Marcus pushed his face into the gap. Even through the blindfold and the static, I could feel the heat of his sneer. We found her, he snarled, not bothering with pleasantries. Celine, what's left of her? I said nothing. I just stood there, a wall of muscle blocking the view into my private hell. Her face was gone, Damien. Turned to dust. Marcus's voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss, thick with faux outrage. It wasn't Wolf's strength that did that. We smelled the residue, magic, old magic. He leaned closer, his breath reeked of raw meat and decay. The human, the useless little stray we gave you, she did it. And? I said, my voice flat. Marcus blinked, clearly taken aback by my lack of surprise. And, Damien, she's a monster hidden in skin, A saboteur. She nearly killed a high-ranking mate of the pack. Celine attacked her first, I said. It was an instinctive defense, a habit of protecting what was mine, even if what was mine was currently a nuclear bomb chained to my bed. It doesn't matter. Marcus slammed his hand against the doorframe. She is an unregistered magical threat within the estate walls. By pack law, she is to be put down immediately, publicly, to show the humans what happens when they cavort with things they don't understand. He tried to shoulder past me. Hand her over. We'll drag her to the courtyard and let the pack tear her apart before we burn the remains. I didn't budge. I was staring at Marcus, analyzing the scent coming off him. There was anger, yes, and disgust about Celine, but underneath it was something sickeningly slick. It smelled like satisfaction, like a trap finally springing shut. "You aren't surprised?" I whispered. The realization hit me with more force than Irene's magic ever had. It was a cold, clarifying douse of water on the fire of my confusion. Marcus paused. "What?" "You knew," I said, the growl rising in my chest. "When you brought her to the throne room, when you laughed while binding her to me, you knew she wasn't human." Marcus's heartbeat hitched. Just once. A telltale skip. "Don't be absurd, boy. We thought she was just another piece of Miller's Creek trash." "Liar." I stepped into his personal space, forcing him back a stumbling step into the hallway. "You smelled it on her, that metallic tang. You knew she was fey, maybe not what kind, maybe not how strong, but you knew she was a weapon." The silence in the hallway stretched thin. Marcus didn't bother denying it this time. The sneer dropped from his face, replaced by the cold, pragmatic mask of council leadership. "We suspected," Marcus admitted, his voice devoid of apology. "We hoped." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Hoped. "You were a problem, Damien, a broken alpha occupying a seat of power, refusing to die, refusing to step down. An embarrassment." Marcus shrugged, a gesture of chilling indifference. "We gave you a poisoned chalice. We hoped the creature would finish what the plague started 20 years ago, a tragic mating accident, the blind alpha killed by his unstable human pet, neat, tidy." He gestured impatiently toward the room behind me. "Instead, she crippled Celine and exposed herself. She failed. The game is over. Now give us the bitch so we can clean up this mess and find a replacement for you that actually functions." The hallway went silent. My entire world had dissolved twice in the span of an hour. Irene had played me. She had used my body and my rage as camouflage for an act of geopolitical sabotage. But the council, the wolves who claimed to be my kin, my superiors, they had actively tried to murder me by proxy. They hadn't just mocked me, they had sanctioned my assassination because I was inconvenient. Irene had called me a tool. She was right. I had been the council's executioner waiting for my own sentence. Behind me, through the crack in the door, I felt the heat of the summer court pulse. I looked at Marcus. I saw the gray static of his face, the arrogance that assumed I would obey because I had always obeyed, because I was the broken dog. "You wanted a weapon," I said softly, my voice shaking with a rage so pure it felt like clarity. "Give her to us, Damien," Marcus commanded, losing patience. The guards behind him tensed, ready to force their way in. I thought about the woman chained to my floor, the monster who had given me my sight back just by existing near me, the creature who could turn bone to dust but had let me rut against her in a dirty shack because it served her purpose. She was dangerous. She was the enemy. But she wasn't the one who had kept me blind for 20 years. "No," I said. Marcus froze. "What did you say to me, whelp?" I said no, and I slammed the heavy oak door in his face, throwing the deadbolt with a sound like a gunshot.
The iron was a dull, sickening throb against my wrists and ankles. It was crude human magic, cold and grounding, designed to dampen the fire in my blood. It was annoying, like a persistent migraine, but hardly debilitating. If I really wanted to, I could melt these cuffs into slag, though the effort would leave me unpleasantly drained after the spectacle of in the woods. I sat on the Alpha's bed, a ridiculous piece of furniture that smelled faintly of his sweat and dried semen, and listened to the wolves barking at the door. It was amusing, in a tedious sort of way. They postured and snarled, their little hierarchies so fragile, so desperately important to them. I could smell Marcus through the thick oak, decay and desperate ambition. I could smell Damien too. For weeks his scent had been a chaotic mess of repressed rage, humiliation, and a strange, underlying current of ozone that my presence seemed to amplify. Now, standing in that doorway, blocking his masters from their prize, his scent was singular. It was the smell of a cornered animal deciding it preferred death to submission. I expected him to fold. They always folded. He was a broken thing, a whipped cur trained to snap only when ordered. He would hand me over to save his own miserable skin, and I would have to incinerate Marcus and his lackeys, blowing my cover entirely and accelerating the timetable for the Civil War. Messy. Inefficient. Then the deadbolt hammered home with a sound like a breaking spine. The silence that followed in the hallway was delicious. The sheer, flabbergasted shock of the council was a palpable wave of energy that seeped into the room. I blinked, genuinely surprised for the first time since I'd stepped foot on this wretched estate. The dog had bitten the hand. Damien turned from the door. The blindfold was still a pathetic affectation across his face, but beneath it, I knew his vision was swimming with the radiant energy pouring off me. He looked at me, and for a second I saw the terrifying potential I had accidentally unlocked. He wasn't just an angry wolf anymore. He was an angry wolf who could see the weave of the world. "They're going to come through," he growled, his voice deeper than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't a statement of fear, it was a statement of fact. "Yes," I murmured, rattling my chains gently. "They are." "Stay down." Before I could offer a scathing retort about who exactly he thought he was ordering around, the door exploded inward. Splinters of ancient oak turned into shrapnel. A massive brown wolf, one of Marcus's personal guards, barreled through the breach, jaws snapping, already anticipating the kill. What happened next was educational. I had watched Damien fight before. In the training rings, he was brutal but clumsy, relying on sensory input that was easily overwhelmed. He fought like a blind man, flailing in the dark. This was not that man. Damien didn't just react, he anticipated. He saw the energy signature of the attacking wolf before the muscle even twitched. He sidestepped the lunge with contemptible ease, a blur of motion that ended with his hand clamping onto the back of the intruder's neck. There was a sickening crunch. Wet and final, Damien tossed the twitching body aside like garbage and met the next wave. It was a slaughter in a phone booth. 4 guards and Marcus piled into the airy, filling the space with the overwhelming stench of aggression. Damien met them in the center of the room, a whirlwind of violence. He was fighting with a clarity that was terrifying to behold. He was using my light to see them, really see them, in a way he never had before. He tore throats out with surgical precision. He broke limbs at the joint, dodging claws and teeth by millimeters because he could see the intent forming in their minds before their bodies could execute it. It was messy, visceral, and utterly devoid of hesitation. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, slicking the fur of the rugs. The air grew thick with the copper tang of carnage and the high, whining whimpers of dying predators. Marcus the coward hung back near the ruined doorway, his eyes wide with disbelief as he watched the broken Alpha dismantle his elite guard like they were pups. Damien finished the last guard, dragging him down and practically decapitating him with a savage bite to the jugular, and turned his attention to the doorway. He was drenched in gore, chest heaving, the blindfold hanging loose around his neck, revealing eyes that were scarred and milky white, yet staring with predatory focus. Marcus didn't even try to fight. He turned and fled down the spiral stairs, howling for reinforcements. The hunt was on. The airy fell silent, save for Damien's ragged breathing and the wet sounds of the dying guards on the floor. He stood there for a moment, vibrating with adrenaline, the wolf very close to the surface. Then he turned slowly and looked at me. I was still sitting on the bed, chains resting in my lap. I hadn't moved during the melee. I hadn't needed to. He walked toward me, tracking bloody footprints across the stone. He didn't stop until his knees hit the edge of the mattress. The heat coming off him was immense, a furnace of exertion and liberated rage. He reached into a pouch at his belt, taken from one of the dead guards, I realized, and pulled out a heavy iron key. He didn't say anything. He just knelt at my feet, the movement almost devotional in its strangeness, and slotted the key into the cuffs at my ankles. The mechanism clicked open. He moved to my wrists next. When the last cuff fell away, clattering loudly on the stone floor, I rubbed my wrists. The skin was red and irritated where the iron had bitten. I stood up. He remained kneeling for a second, head bowed, breathing hard. The dynamic in the room had shifted so violently it made my head spin. The jailer had just slaughtered his own kin to free his prisoner. "You realize," I said, my voice cool against the heat of the room, "that was exceedingly foolish. You just declared war on your entire world." Damien stood slowly, towering over me again. But the intimidation was gone. It was replaced by a grim, terrifying partnership. He wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing it across his jaw. "They were never my world," he rasped. He looked down at me, his milky eyes seeing the nuclear fire burning beneath my skin. "They were just the cage." He stepped over a cooling corpse toward the door. "Are you coming? Or are you going to wait for them to bring an army up those stairs?" I looked at the carnage, then at the back of the man who had caused it. My mission had been to rot this place from the inside. But as I watched him stride out of the room to face impossible odds, I realized plans could change. Rot was slow, fire was much faster. A slow, cruel smile spread across my face. I stepped over the dead wolves and followed the alpha into the hall. "Lead on, Wolf," I said softly. "Let's burn it all down." The castle was waking up. Marcus's howls had done their job. The stone halls, usually silent tombs at this hour, echoed with the slamming of doors, shouting voices, and the unmistakable thud of boots and paws moving with frantic purpose. We were running. Damien led the way, a juggernaut of bloody muscle moving with a terrifying newfound grace. I followed close behind, my own senses vibrating with the chaotic energy of the estate coming alive to hunt us. It was exhilarating. We took the servant stairs, a narrow, winding corkscrew of cold stone that bypassed the main thoroughfares. Damien took them two at a time, practically sliding down the railings, his knowledge of the castle's anatomy instinctive even after decades of blindness. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice low. I wasn't out of breath. Face stamina was another thing the wolves had conveniently forgotten, but the sheer pace was demanding. "Out," he threw back over his shoulder. "The main gate is a choke point. They'll hold it. We need postern gate by the kennels. It leads directly to the outer ring." "The outer ring. The slums." My stomach tightened slightly. It was a smart move. Chaos was our ally, and the slums were nothing but chaos, but it was also a trap. Once we were out there, we were surrounded by the estate wall on one side and the council's army on the other. "They'll bottle us in," I said, leaping over a broken crate in the stairwell. "Let them try," he growled, shouldering open a heavy wooden door at the bottom of the stairs. We burst out into the lower bailey, near the kitchens. The air here was thick with the smell of wood smoke and rendering fat. It was also full of wolves. A dozen guards were already converging on the area, drawn by the noise. They froze for half a second at the sight of us, their alpha, drenched in the blood of his own kind, running with the human slave he was supposed to have executed. That half second was all Damien needed. He hit the first line like a freight train. No finesse this time, just brute, unstoppable momentum. He shoulder-checked a massive gray wolf, sending him flying into a stack of barrels that exploded in a shower of salted fish. He caught another guard by the throat and slammed him into the stone wall with enough force to crack the masonry. It was a running battle. We didn't stop to finish them, we just plowed through. Damien was the plow. I was the scorching wind behind him. A young guard, over-eager and foolish, tried to flank Damien. I saw him coming before he even fully committed to the lunge. I didn't have time for subtlety. I flicked my wrist. A lash of pure, condensed summer magic, hotter than a forge, brighter than the sun, snapped out. It struck the wolf in midair. There was no sound of impact, just a sharp crack as the air was instantly superheated. The wolf was thrown backward as if hit by a cannonball, his chest scorched black, his fur smoldering. He didn't get up. Damien glanced back just for a fraction of a second. He saw the carnage, saw the glowing aura around my hands, and grunted a low sound of approval. We ran on. The kennel yard was ahead. The stench of dog and fear was overwhelming here. The hunting hounds were baying in their cages, driven mad by the scent of blood and alpha aggression. The postern gate was a small, iron-reinforced door set into the massive outer wall. It was guarded by two hulking enforcers who looked bored and unhappy with their posting. They weren't bored for long. Damien didn't even slow down. He roared, a sound that was half wolf, half something primal and broken, and threw himself at them. They went down in a tangle of limbs and teeth. I saw Damien's jaws snap, saw blood spray, and then he was up again, yanking the heavy iron key from the belt of a dead man. He jammed the key into the lock, twisted, and kicked the door open. The smell of the outer ring hit us instantly. Open sewage, unwashed bodies, wood rot, and despair. It was the smell of home, in a twisted sort of way. We burst through the gate and stumbled out onto the muddy thoroughfare of the slums. The gate slammed shut behind us with a final metallic clang. We stopped, chests heaving, lungs burning. We were standing in the middle of the main muddy track that ran through the human shantytown. The few humans who were out at this hour, scavengers, night soil collectors, scattered like cockroaches at the sight of us. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a held breath before the scream. I looked back at the castle wall. It loomed over us, 50 feet of sheer gray stone topped with watchtowers. We were out of the castle, but we were still inside the cage. And the cage was closing in. From the ramparts above, torches flared to life, dozens of them, illuminating the muddy ground around us in pools of flickering orange light. The sound of heavy boots on stone echoed from the walls. The massive main gate of the castle, 50 yards down the wall to our left, began to groan open. The gears shrieked in protest. Through the widening gap, I could see them. A sea of fur and armor, the entire garrison. Marcus was at the front, mounted on a massive war horse, looking down at us with a mixture of fury and triumphant glee. "There's nowhere to go, Damien!" Marcus's voice boomed from the walls, amplified by the stone acoustics. "You've run into a dead end, boy. Give us the witch, and we'll make your death quick." Damien straightened up. The blood on his face and chest was drying into a grotesque mask. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at me. "You were right," he said, his voice rough but steady. "About the Civil War." I raised an eyebrow, the magic humming just beneath my skin, ready to be unleashed. "Oh!" "It's too slow," he said. He turned away from me and faced the oncoming army. He faced the walls, the towers, the entire monolithic structure of the werewolf dominion that had despised him since birth. He took a deep breath, his massive chest expanding, and threw his head back. The howl that ripped from his throat was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't a call to the pack. It wasn't a challenge to a rival. It was a declaration of annihilation. It was a sound full of 20 years of darkness, pain, and rage, amplified by the sudden, terrifying clarity of a world seen in high definition. It went on, a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of my bones, shaking the flimsy shacks of the slums around us. It was a sound that said, "I am the Alpha, and I am here to end you." As the howl faded into a menacing echo, Damien lowered his head and looked at the army massing in the gateway. He raised a hand, palm open, toward them. "Irene!" he said, his voice a low rumble that carried over the stunned silence of the battlefield. "Light them up!" I smiled. It was a feral, terrifying thing that felt right on my face for the first time in years. I stepped up beside him, shoulder to shoulder with the monster I had created. I let the glamour drop completely. The air around me shrieked as the magic flooded out. My skin began to glow, first a soft gold, then intensifying into a blinding, searing, white-hot emerald fire. My hair lifted from my shoulders, floating on the rising tide of arcane energy. The ground beneath my feet began to smoke and crack, the mud turning to ceramic instantly. The humans in the slums screamed and ran, shielding their eyes. On the walls, the guards stumbled back, blinded by the sudden star that had ignited in their midst. The army at the gate wavered. The horses reared in panic. Even Marcus looked momentarily terrified as he stared at the high-born Fae hovering on the edge of releasing a cataclysm. I looked at Damien. He was watching me, his milky eyes reflecting the terrible light, a grim smile mirroring my own. We were outnumbered 100 to 1. We were trapped. We were almost certainly going to die. But by the ancient gods and the new, we were going to make such a beautiful pyre of their world.
close your eyes, but I won't let this be goodbye. If this is the end, just stay with me. One last kiss, that's all we'll need. Hold me until the war ends. Don't let go, don't pretend. If the world burns down tonight, I'll still be yours in the fading light. Hold me. Hold me until the war ends. The air is heavy, the night's cold, but in your arms I'm still whole. I don't know what tomorrow brings, but here and now we have everything. If we survive, if we fall, promise me you'll